The auction was held on a Thursday morning in April 1983 in the basement of the Midlands County Administrative Building in Harlow, Indiana. The building itself was a two-story structure of pale brick that had been erected in 1954 and had aged in the way that utilitarian public buildings age, not gracefully but honestly, accumulating the evidence of its use in the scuffed baseboards and the worn patches on the linoleum and the particular institutional smell of old paper and floor wax and coffee that has been made in the same urn for too many years without the urn being properly cleaned. The basement held 3 rooms. The largest was used for meetings of the county commissioners and on occasion for auctions of county-held property, which took place 4 times a year on the second Thursday of January, April, July, and October. The room had a low ceiling with fluorescent panels that hummed at a frequency just below the threshold of conscious annoyance, which meant that after 30 minutes in the room you were slightly irritated without being able to say why. Someone had set up a folding table near the door with a coffee urn and a stack of styrofoam cups, and by 8:30 the coffee was already gone, and nobody had thought to make more, which was typical of county auctions in Midlands County, and had been typical for as long as anyone who attended them regularly could remember. The folding chairs were arranged in uneven rows by whoever had set up the room that morning, arranged with the particular lack of precision that suggests the task was done by someone who understood that perfect alignment was unnecessary because the room was never going to be full. There were perhaps 20 chairs. 12 of them had people in them when the auction began at 9 o'clock. By 9:15, 2 of those people had left, having determined that the parcels they were interested in had already sold or would not be reaching the price they were willing to pay. County land auctions in Midlands County in the spring of 1983 did not draw crowds. They drew the people who needed to be there, people who had identified specific parcels in the advance listing and had done some research and had a number in mind, and a handful of others who came out of general curiosity or because they had nothing better to do on a Thursday morning and the county building was warm. That was about the extent of it. The auction was not advertised beyond the statutory notice in the Harlow Courier-Journal, which ran on the Thursday and Saturday preceding the auction date, and most people who read the Harlow Courier-Journal did not read the legal notices section because the legal notices section was in small type and was placed adjacent to the classified ads for used farm equipment, which was the section most people in Harlow County were actually looking for. Clara Merritt sat in the 4th row. She had driven 40 minutes to get there alone in the truck Walt used for hauling feed. It was a 1974 Ford F-150 in a shade of green that had faded over 9 years of Indiana weather to something between sage and gray, with a cracked dashboard and a heater that worked on the driver's side only. The truck smelled like grain dust and motor oil and the particular combination of accumulated working smells that a vehicle develops over years of being used hard for the purpose it was built for. She had driven without the radio on. She had things she wanted to think through on the drive, and she thought better without noise competing for her attention. This was a fact about herself she had known since she was a young woman and had accommodated ever since without making much of it. She wore her gray wool coat. It was a good coat. She had bought it in 1971 from a department store in Kenton during a clearance sale, and it had been worth every cent of what she paid, which was not very much because it was a clearance sale, but was still more than she would ordinarily have spent on a coat. It was the coat she wore to church in cold weather and to the bank on the occasions when she needed to speak to someone at the bank about something that required the implicit authority of a serious coat. It had a small repair at the left cuff, a place where the wool had worn thin, and she had reinforced it with a thread so carefully matched to the original fabric that you had to know the repair was there to see it, and most people didn't know and therefore didn't see it. She carried a canvas tote bag, plain gray-green, the kind sold at farm supply stores as a general-purpose carrying bag with a spiral notebook inside a mechanical pencil with 2 spare leads stored in the cap. and a manila folder held shut with a thick rubber band. The folder contained 14 pages of handwritten notes she had made over the previous 6 weeks, organized in her bookkeeper's shorthand that was legible to her and would have been largely opaque to anyone else. She had not told Walt what the notes were for. She had told him she was going to a county property auction, and he had nodded over his morning coffee without looking up from the seed catalog he was reading, which was the response she had expected, and in fact, the response she had wanted. Walt was not a man who required explanations for things that did not immediately affect him, and Clara had not yet decided whether this thing would affect him, so she had offered no explanation, and he had asked for none. This was one of the many small harmonies of their long marriage. She was 52 years old. She had spent 21 years as the head bookkeeper at the Harlow Grain Elevator, which was the largest grain handling facility in Midlands County and one of the 3 largest in the surrounding 5 counties. The job had required her to manage the financial records of an operation that processed several million bushels of grain per year, to track receivables and payables and storage fees and transportation contracts and seasonal price adjustments across a system of considerable complexity, and to do all of this with a precision that left no ambiguity about where every dollar had gone or come from. She had been extraordinarily good at this. She had been so good at it that when she retired from the position in 1992, which was still 9 years in the future on this April morning in 1983, the elevator's manager would spend 14 months trying to replace her with a single hire before conceding that the job as she had done it required 2 people, and hiring 2. What the job had taught her more than anything else was not how to work with numbers, but how to read them. How to look at a column of figures and understand what the figures were describing about the underlying reality. How to identify the number that was wrong, not because it was obviously wrong, but because all the other numbers in the column were right, and this one disrupted the pattern in a way that meant something. She had this capacity in an unusual degree. It was not something she had been taught. It was something she had always had, which the job had developed and refined over 21 years of daily practice. She was not large and she was not loud. She did not call attention to herself in public spaces. She was the kind of woman who could sit in a room for 2 hours and be remembered afterward, if she was remembered at all, as someone who had been quiet and attentive and had not been notable in any particular way. This was not a limitation. It was, she had come to understand over the years, a form of advantage in situations where being underestimated was useful. The auctioneer was a heavyset man named Bart Cushman, who had been conducting county auctions in Midlands County for 11 years, and who had developed through those 11 years a style that was efficient when he was focused and slightly theatrical when he thought the room needed warming up. He wore a bolo tie with a turquoise slide, which he wore to every auction and which had become among the small community of people who attended these events regularly. Something of a landmark, Bart's bolo tie, signaling that the proceedings were official and that the county's business was being done. He moved through the morning's parcels in sequence, reading from a typed sheet that he held in one hand and annotated with a pen in the other, describing each parcel in the flat, formulaic language of county property transactions, parcel number, acreage, or dimensions, location by reference to section and township assessed value, any known encumbrances or easements. A gravel lot on the county's south edge, adjacent to the township road, assessed at $400, sold for $320. A drainage easement along a creek in the county's northwest section, a strip of land running along the bank that the county had held since a flood control project in 1965 and no longer had a use, for sold for $80 to a farmer who owned the adjacent field and had been trying to consolidate it for 3 years. 2 residential remnants from a subdivision that had been platted in 1971 and had never materialized. The developer had gone bankrupt in 1973, and the parcels had reverted to the county through a complicated series of legal proceedings that the clerk's office had spent 4 years resolving, each sold for amounts slightly above their assessed value to buyers who had apparently decided that owning a residential lot in a non-existent subdivision was worth more than the county thought it was. Clara watched each sale and wrote the price in her notebook. She was not interested in any of those parcels. She was waiting for a specific one, and she tracked the progress of the morning's business with the patience of someone who has somewhere to be and knows exactly when they need to be there. Then Bart Cushman cleared his throat, which was his signal that he was moving from one item to the next, and he smoothed the paper on his clipboard, and he announced County Strip 77-204. He read the description twice, as though repetition might clarify something that was inherently unclear. 14 feet wide, 6/10 of a mile long, running north to south along the eastern boundary of what had once been the proposed survey corridor for a county arterial road expansion designated CR Project 14C, planned in the late 1960s and canceled in September of 1969 after a right-of-way dispute with a landowner on the northern terminus of the proposed route. Since the cancellation, the strip had sat on the county's books as an inactive holding, not residential, not agricultural, not classified under any of the county's standard land use categories in a way that made it useful to anyone. It had been listed in the county auction catalog 3 times in the previous decade and had not sold any of those times. The county taxed it at a nominal annual rate and had never attempted to develop it or incorporate it into any adjacent parcel because the legal complications of doing so had always seemed more trouble than the strip was worth. Bart described it as a remnant parcel with limited development potential. He used the phrase limited development potential, the way an honest man uses a phrase that means something worse than it sounds. He used it because professional convention required some gesture toward optimism, but he deployed it without conviction. His tone to anyone listening carefully said clearly that he expected this to be another non-sale, another item that would circle back through the next auction and the one after that, until either someone bought it out of sheer stubbornness or the county found a legal mechanism to make it go away. The man in the second row laughed. His name was Garrison Holst. He was 41 years old, and he had the physical presence of a man who had been athletic in his 20s and had since become simply large, the athleticism having translated over the years of an executive desk job and regular business lunches into a broad-shouldered, well-fed solidity that was not unimpressive, but that no longer suggested any particular physical capability. He had a face that photographed well symmetrical, with a strong jaw and clear eyes, and the kind of regular features that read as trustworthy in pictures, but that in person, if you looked at it carefully, revealed something calculating beneath the pleasantness, a quality of ongoing assessment in the eyes that never quite rested, that was always measuring the room. He managed the Harlow branch of First Midland National Bank, which was the county's largest bank and one of the more significant regional banks in central Indiana. He had managed the branch for 6 years and had grown it considerably during that time, increasing commercial lending volume and opening 2 satellite locations in neighboring townships. He was regarded in Harlow business circles as capable and ambitious in roughly equal measure, and the combination had served him well. He had come to the auction that morning because a junior loan officer at his branch had mentioned in passing during a Monday morning staff meeting that the county's spring auction sometimes included agricultural parcels that went for below-market prices, and that a man with ready capital and patience might occasionally find something worth having. Garrison Holst was a man with ready capital and a banker's patience, and he had nothing scheduled until 11, so he had come to look. He wore a sport coat that was a level of quality above what the room required, which was deliberate. Garrison Holst dressed for the impression he wanted to make, not for the room he was in, and he carried a leather portfolio that he had not opened once since he sat down because he had not seen anything that required writing down. He had the comfortable, slightly bored posture of a man who expects most situations to resolve in his favor if he simply shows up and waits, which had been true often enough in his experience that he had stopped questioning it as a general strategy. He laughed at the parcel description. Not a long laugh, not a performative laugh, but the short dismissive laugh of a man expressing a judgment he considers obvious, the laugh of someone who has already classified something as beneath his attention and is signaling that classification to the room because the room's agreement seems guaranteed. He said in a voice that carried easily in the low-ceilinged basement space that a man would need to be genuinely confused about the value of money to pay good money for a strip of nothing. He said it without looking around to gauge the response because the response seemed to him so certain that checking for it was unnecessary. The two men sitting beside him, local farmers who had come for the residential lots and stayed when those sold, quickly remaining in their chairs with the inertia of people who have committed a morning to a particular location, smiled at this. They smiled the vaguely collaborative smile of people who agree with something they haven't thought about. The woman in the fourth row did not look at Garrison Holst. She looked at Bart Cushman. Bart started the bidding at $200. He said it with the practiced neutrality of an auctioneer who knows that the opening number is a formality and that the real negotiation is about to begin. Nobody moved. He looked around the room. He dropped to $175. The man in the front row shifted slightly in his folding chair, but this turned out to be a physical adjustment rather than a bid. 150. 125. The room had the particular quiet of people waiting for something to resolve itself, the quiet of people who have no stake in the outcome and are simply present. Clara raised her hand at $140. She raised it cleanly and without hesitation, not the tentative half-raise of someone uncertain of their bid or uncertain of what they want, but a full clear raise at shoulder height, held steadily, that communicated exactly one thing: I am bidding, and I mean it. Garrison Holst turned around. He turned slowly, with the deliberate ease of a man who moves at his own pace in public spaces, because he has learned that moving at your own pace is a way of indicating that you control the pace. He looked at Clara. He took in her gray wool coat and the repaired cuff and the canvas tote bag on her lap and her age and the unremarkable totality of how she presented in that room, and he looked at her with an expression that was not quite hostility. Hostility would have required him to take her seriously as an adversary, but something more like baffled dismissal, the expression of a man who has encountered something that does not fit his established categories and has defaulted in the absence of a better explanation to the category of irrelevant. He looked at her for perhaps 3 seconds. Then he turned back around. Nobody else raised a hand. Not Garrison Holst, who had already made his opinion of the parcel clear. Not the two farmers beside him who had no interest in a strip of corridor land with no agricultural use. Not the handful of people in the back rows who were there for other items or for curiosity, not investment. Bart looked around the room one final time with the practiced thoroughness of an auctioneer confirming that no further bids are coming. He looked at Holst. He looked at the farmers. He looked at the back rows. The moment stretched to 4 seconds, which is a long time in a room waiting for something to happen. The gavel came down. $140. Clara stood up. She walked to the clerk's table at the front of the room, which was staffed by a young woman with a printed form and a receipt book. She signed the transfer form in her bookkeeper's handwriting, neat, unambiguous, the handwriting of someone for whom legibility is a professional value. She counted out 7 $20 bills from her coat pocket where she had put them that morning, folded together in order so the transaction would require no fumbling. Exact change. She took the deed and folded it into thirds with practiced efficiency and placed it inside the manila folder. She put the rubber band back around the folder. She put the folder in the tote bag. Garrison Holst was talking to the man beside him as she walked back past the second row. He was saying something about a commercial property on the county's main road that he had heard might be coming available. He did not look up as she passed. She had not expected him to. She stopped at the county planning map that was pinned to a corkboard on the far wall. It was a large map, perhaps 3 feet by 4 feet, hand-drawn in black ink on a sheet of drafting paper that had yellowed slightly at the edges, updated by the county planning office every 2 or 3 years when significant boundary changes occurred. It showed the county's entire land area in a grid of section and township lines, with parcel boundaries marked in thinner lines and roads shown in slightly heavier lines, and various notations in small print that indicated zoning classifications and use restrictions and other planning designations. She had spent time with copies of this map. She had studied it at the public library over 6 Tuesday evenings, sitting at the wooden reading table near the back window that got good afternoon light with the county's planning records spread around her and her notebook open in front of her. She knew this map. She found County Strip 77-204 without searching. It was a thin north-south line running along the eastern edge of what was in 1983 uninterrupted farmland, corn and soybeans, rotating through the fields in the pattern that Midlands County's soil and climate, supported with an occasional fence row or farm access road, breaking the monotony of the grid. No paved roads adjacent to the strip's eastern boundary. No visible utility infrastructure within half a mile. No development of any kind that would have indicated the area was on anyone's near-term radar for anything other than continued agricultural use. She put one finger on County Strip 77-204. She stood like that for a moment, her finger resting on the thin line on the map, feeling the slight texture of the drafting paper under her fingertip. She was not making a wish. She was not celebrating. She was doing something she had been doing throughout the 6 weeks of preparation that had led to this morning confirming the alignment between the line on the map and the document in her folder and the understanding in her mind, making sure the 3 things were the same thing, described in 3 different registers. They were. She had known they were before she walked into the room. She needed to stand here one final time to make absolutely certain she was the only one in this room who knew it. She lowered her hand. She turned off the fluorescent light switch by the door when she left because she was the last one out and the light had been left on, and there was no reason to leave a light burning in an empty room. She walked up the stairs and through the administrative building's main lobby and out the front door into the April morning, which was cool and carried the smell of recently turned earth from the fields on the town's western edge where someone had been plowing that week. She drove home. Walt was at the kitchen table when she came through the back door, eating a late breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast with the seed catalog propped against the butter dish so he could read it while he ate. He was a methodical eater who did not require conversation during meals, which was one of the many things about him that Clara had appreciated since the beginning of their marriage. He looked up when she came in, reading her face in the way he had been reading her face for 28 years, looking for information she might not have decided to share yet, looking for what the face told him before the mouth said anything. Her face told him, as it usually told him in these moments, that she had done what she went to do and that she would explain it when she was ready. He had learned over the course of their marriage that pressing for explanation before she was ready was a way of getting an abbreviated version of something that was more interesting in its complete form, and so he had generally stopped pressing. She took her coat off and hung it on the hook beside the door. She went to the stove and poured coffee from the pot that had been sitting long enough to taste slightly strong, which she didn't mind. She sat down across from him. "Well," he said. He set the seed catalog down. "I got what I went for," she said. He looked at her steadily for a moment. He had a face that in repose looked slightly mournful, which was misleading, because he was not a mournful person. It was simply the natural arrangement of his features. "How much?" $140. He was quiet. He picked up his coffee cup. He took a sip. "For the strip?" "Yes." He went back to his eggs. Walt Merritt had spent 30 years farming in Midlands County, which had given him a particular relationship with uncertainty and with the gap between planning and outcome that most people who live in cities never develop. He had seen enough dry springs and wet harvests and price swings and equipment failures to understand that the future was genuinely unpredictable, and that therefore the most useful thing a person could do in the present was make the best decision available with the information they had, and then let the future do what it was going to do. He did not spend energy on skepticism about decisions that had already been made by someone whose judgment he trusted. He trusted Clara's judgment completely. He had learned to trust it completely through 28 years of watching it operate. "What does it do?" he said. "Nothing yet," she said. He looked out the window at the back field. The corn from the previous fall had been disked under, and the field was bare, dark soil showing through the remnants of old stubble. "How long before it does something?" She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "I don't know exactly. Could be 10 years, could be 20, possibly longer." He nodded. He chewed his toast. He was thinking about it in the unhurried way he thought about most things, turning it over, examining it from the available angles, arriving at something he could live with. He did not say that 20 years was too long, or that $140 was too much for something that might never do anything. He said, "Well, you'll know what to do with it when the time comes." She looked at him across the table. 28 years of mornings at this table. 28 years of his face across from hers in this kitchen, in all the ordinary moments that a long marriage accumulates and that a person does not understand the weight of until much later, when the accumulation is no longer being added to. He was not a complicated man. He was a good man in the complete and unqualified sense of that phrase. She had always known how lucky she was, and she had never once taken it for granted, which is not something that can be said of everyone who is lucky. "Yes," she said, "I will." What Clara knew, and what no one else in that auction room had known, and what she had spent 6 weeks in the Harlow Public Library making absolutely certain of before she drove across Midlands County on a Thursday morning to bid $140 on a 14-foot strip of nothing, what she knew was this. In 1967, Midlands County had submitted a formal application to the Indiana Department of Transportation for state funding assistance with the expansion of County Road 14, the north-south arterial that ran along the county's eastern section. The expansion was intended to convert the existing two-lane road into a proper arterial connector that would serve the agricultural and light industrial development that the county's planning commission had projected for the eastern section over the following 2 decades. The application was approved by the state in 1968. A survey corridor was established. Engineers from the state's highway division staked the proposed right-of-way that followed a corridor running north to south through the eastern farmland, 14 feet wider than the existing road on the eastern side, to accommodate the expanded pavement and shoulders. The project was formally designated CR Project 14C and entered into the state's capital improvement planning database in January of 1969. But in June of 1969, the project ran into a problem that nobody had anticipated. A landowner named Harold Becker, whose farm sat at the northern terminus of the proposed expansion route, filed a formal right-of-way objection with the county commissioners, arguing that the proposed taking of a strip of his land for road right-of-way would bisect his farmstead in a way that made his existing farming operation impossible to continue. The objection was not frivolous. Becker's farmstead was arranged around a central access lane that the proposed right-of-way would cut, making it impossible to move equipment between his barn and his fields without crossing the new road. The county's initial response was that Becker would need to build a crossing, which Becker found insufficient and his attorney found legally vulnerable. The dispute went to a county hearing in August. The hearing produced no resolution. In September, Becker threatened federal court action, citing a procedural defect in the state's right-of-way appraisal process. By October of 1969, The political calculation around CR Project 14C had changed. The state funding that had been allocated to the project had a fiscal year deadline, and the dispute with Becker had pushed the timeline past the point where the funding could be drawn down before the deadline. The state offered a one-year extension, but the county commissioners, facing a contentious election year and a landowner with a legitimate grievance and an attorney who knew what he was doing, voted in September 1969 to cancel CR Project 14C. The cancellation resolution was drafted by the county attorney's office and approved by a vote of 3-2 at a commissioners' meeting on the 9th of September 1969. The cancellation resolution was 3 pages long. Clara had read it many times in the library's records room carefully, including the appendices, which most people who read county commissioner resolutions never read, because appendices to county commissioner resolutions are generally not interesting. The appendix to the September 9, 1969 cancellation resolution for CR Project 14-C contained in its third section a footnote that was 3 lines long. The footnote referenced an Indiana Department of Transportation filing from January 1968, the same filing that had assigned the survey corridor its formal right-of-way classification, and noted that the corridor had been assigned as part of the federal program under which the state's funding application had been processed, a federal utility infrastructure designation under the Federal Land Use Planning Act of 1966. The footnote stated that the cancellation of CR Project 14C voided the road project and released the state's funding commitment, but did not address the federal utility corridor designation, which had been assigned through a separate administrative process and would require separate administrative action to dissolve. 3 lines. In an appendix. In a document that had been sitting in the county's records room since 1969, available to anyone who asked for it, read closely by essentially no one. The separate administrative action had never been taken. Clara had confirmed this through a public records request submitted to the Indiana Department of Transportation 6 weeks before the auction. The response had come back in 12 days, no record of any administrative action to dissolve the federal utility corridor designation associated with the survey corridor of CR Project 14C in Midlands County. The designation remained on the books. The corridor remained in the language of federal infrastructure planning law, an active utility infrastructure right-of-way governed by the provisions of the Federal Land Use Planning Act of 1966 and the implementing regulations of the Indiana Department of Transportation. This was not a dormant designation that existed only on paper. Under the federal program, an active utility infrastructure designation carried specific legal characteristics. The designated corridor could not be absorbed into adjacent parcels through quiet title proceedings. Absorbing it would require dissolving the federal designation first. It could not be landlocked through surrounding development. The owner of the corridor was entitled to access regardless of what was built around it. And any project, any infrastructure project of any kind that needed to run utilities through the north-south axis of the eastern section of Midlands County would at some point need to obtain legal access from whoever held the title to the corridor. This was not a speculative future. It was a structural fact about what the corridor was and what it did. Clara had spent 6 weeks in the library understanding this structural fact from every angle she could approach it from. She had read the Federal Land Use Planning Act of 1966. She had read the Indiana Implementing Regulations. She had read the 1968 INDOT filing that had assigned the designation. She had read everything she could find about what utility infrastructure designations meant legally and operationally, including 3 law review articles from the Indiana Law Journal that she had requested through interlibrary loan and that had taken 2 weeks to arrive. She was not a lawyer. She was a bookkeeper. But she had always believed that the difference between understanding a legal document and not understanding it was mostly a matter of willingness to read carefully and dictionary access for the words she didn't know, and she had approached these legal documents with the same methodical attention she had brought to grain elevator financial records for 21 years. By the time she walked into the auction on that Thursday morning in April of 1983, she was certain of the following: the strip was not what the auctioneer said it was. It was not a remnant. It was not nothing. It was an active federal utility corridor designation embedded in 14 feet of Indiana farmland, and whoever held the title to that corridor held something that was, in the structural language of infrastructure law, irreplaceable. You could not build around it. You could not over it. You could not, through any ordinary legal mechanism, make it go away without dealing with its owner. She had paid $140 for it. She had not smiled when the gavel came down, because she was not the kind of person who smiled when things went according to plan. Going according to plan was the normal outcome of having planned correctly. She confirmed the alignment of the map and the document and the understanding, and she turned off the light and she drove home, and she drank her coffee, and she told Walt it would do something in 10 or 20 years, and she meant it every word. Over the following year and a half, Clara drove past County Strip 77-200 423 times. She was precise about this count because she logged each visit in the notebook, one line per entry: the date, the time of day, the direction she was driving, the condition of the county road adjacent to the strip's western edge, any observable changes in the surrounding parcels, any vehicles or equipment she saw in the vicinity. She was not trying to be noticed. She drove at normal speed on the county road, slowing only slightly as she passed the strip, the way a person slows slightly on a familiar road when they are looking at something specific. She did not stop and walk on the strip because she did not want anyone to see her paying attention to it in a way that suggested she knew something they might want to know. Nothing changed in those first 18 months. The strip looked the same each time she passed it, a corridor of unmowed grass and weeds running along the eastern boundary of a field planted in rotating corn and soybeans, bounded on the west by the gravel county road, and on the east by a wire fence that belonged to the adjacent parcel. The fence was in decent repair. The grass in the strip was approximately knee-high by June, and was cut back, she noted, to ankle height by October, which meant someone, presumably the county, as part of its routine maintenance of properties on its books, even after sale, was mowing it once a season. She made note of this. A mowed strip was a maintained strip, which would be relevant later if anyone questioned whether the property had been neglected. In November of 1983, she went to the county recorder's office to file the deed and pay the first year's property tax. The tax was $13.20, which the county calculated based on the strip's assessed value of $110, a figure that reflected the county's view of what 14 feet of unusable corridor was worth, which was not much. She paid in cash, exact change, and received a printed receipt that she filed in the manila folder. She noted the receipt number and the payment date in the notebook. In the spring of 1984, something changed. She saw it on her March pass: survey flags, orange plastic flags, on thin wire stakes, planted at intervals of approximately 30 feet along the boundary of the parcel that lay immediately north of the strip. She counted 11 flags as she drove past, maintaining her normal speed, not slowing enough to be obvious. She wrote the count and the date and a description of the flag color and placement in the notebook. She drove past again in April. The flags were still there. In May, a white pickup truck with an Indianapolis County plate, she noted the partial plate number as she drove past, was parked on the gravel shoulder of the county road, adjacent to the north parcel. 2 men were in the field with surveying equipment, a level rod, and a theodolite on a tripod working along the parcel's western boundary. She saw them on the way to the grocery store in Harlow and turned around at the next farm crossroad, telling herself she had forgotten something, which was not true. She pulled onto a farm access road a quarter mile south of the strip and sat in the truck with the engine off and watched through the windshield. The two men worked for approximately 2 more hours. They were methodical and professional. When they finished, they loaded the equipment into the truck bed, made some entries on clipboards, and drove away toward the highway. She followed at a sufficient distance that she could read the full plate number before they turned north, and she lost them. She wrote the full plate number in the notebook when she got home. She also wrote North Parcel Survey Activity, Likely Acquisition Survey. 2 men, professional equipment, white truck with Indianapolis plate. March flag still in place. Activity suggests buyer in process of finalizing acquisition. In October of 1984, she went to the county recorder's office to pay her annual taxes, $13.20, exact change receipt. And while she was at the counter with Dottie, who had worked that counter for 16 years and knew the filing system as well as she knew her own house, Clara asked, in the casual way of someone who is mildly curious, rather than urgently interested, whether there had been any transfer activity on the parcels adjacent to the old CR corridor strip in the past year. Dottie checked. She was helpful by nature and by professional habit, and she saw nothing unusual in the question, which was the kind of question that neighbors and adjacent landowners asked routinely. Yes, she said. The north parcel had recorded a transfer in September. She pulled the transfer record. The buyer was listed as Meridian Land Group, LLC, with a registered address in Indianapolis. Clara wrote the name in her notebook that evening. She wrote it exactly as it had appeared on the transfer record, with the comma between Meridian Land Group and LLC, and the period after the LLC. Then she wrote the date of the transfer and the recorded sale price, which was also public information, and she wrote the name of the registered agent for the LLC as Dottie had shown it to her from the accompanying filing. In December of 1984, she submitted a public records request to the Indiana Secretary of State's office for the complete registered agent and officer information for Meridian Land Group, LLC. The response came back in 2 weeks. Registered agent was a law firm on the north side of Indianapolis, with a suite number in a building that Clara, based on the address, determined was a professional office building rather than a standalone law office. The officers listed were names she did not recognize. She wrote all of this in the notebook. She did not yet have the final piece. She had the puzzle assembled up to the point where one piece was missing and the picture was not yet complete. The final piece arrived on an afternoon in March of 1985 when Walt brought in the week's mail and set it on the kitchen table and went back outside, and one of the envelopes was the quarterly newsletter from First Midland National Bank. Walt had a small line of credit at First Midland National's Harlow branch used for equipment purchases, and as a commercial customer, he received the bank's quarterly newsletter, which was a 3-page document printed on cream-colored paper that was mostly public relations and community relations content, with a small amount of banking information embedded in it. Clara had been about to put the newsletter in the recycling bin without reading it. She had put her hand on it and was lifting it when something at the top of the 3rd page caught her eye. Not a headline, because the newsletter didn't use headlines, but a paragraph that began with the phrase, "Growth through strategic real estate investment," and that mentioned in its 2nd sentence the bank's affiliate acquisition entity. She set the newsletter down on the table. She read the paragraph 3 times. The bank's affiliate acquisition entity mentioned in the 2nd sentence was Meridian Land Group, LLC. She went to the desk in the living room and got the notebook and the manila folder. She put them on the kitchen table beside the newsletter. She opened the notebook to the page where she had written Meridian Land Group, LLC in October of 1984. She looked at the 2 pieces of information together. First Midland National Bank, Garrison Holst's bank. The branch manager who had attended the April 1983 auction and had laughed at the description of County Strip 77-204 and had called it a strip of nothing in front of witnesses, His bank had, through a real estate affiliate that shared a registered agent with a professional office building in Indianapolis, acquired the parcel immediately north of the Strip, 9 months after Garrison Holst had decided the Strip was beneath his attention. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time looking at this. She was not angry. She was not excited. She was experiencing the particular quiet, almost physical satisfaction that she associated with the moment when a column of numbers that has been resisting her for days finally balances, not triumph, not vindication, but the clean satisfaction of a pattern completing itself of something she has known to be true, being proven true in a way that removes all residual doubt. She turned to a fresh page in the notebook. She wrote larger than her usual small, precise handwriting 3 words at the top of the page. They don't know. She underlined each word once. Then she went back to her normal handwriting and wrote below the 3 words, Garrison Holst, Branch Manager, First Midland National Bank, Harlow Branch. Attended Midlands County Property Auction, April 7, 1983. Lot 77-204, described parcel as strip of nothing, did not bid, laughed at parcel description in front of the room. Below that, Meridian Land Group, LLC confirmed, First Midland National Bank Affiliate, C Bank Newsletter, March 1985, page 3, paragraph 4. Acquired north parcel, immediately adjacent to Strip 77-200, 4 September 1984, per County Recorder Records. Acquisition survey, observed spring/summer 1984. Below that bank is assembling parcels in the Eastern Corridor without knowing what the corridor is. They are building a position around a gap they do not understand. The gap is the federal utility designation. The gap is mine. Below that underlined once, they don't know what they're assembling around. She closed the notebook. She put it back in the tote bag with the manila folder. Walt was starting dinner in the kitchen. She could hear the refrigerator opening and closing and the sound of a pan on the burner. And she sat at the desk for another few minutes, feeling the weight of what she had assembled settling into something clear and still and certain, the way a balance sheet settles when the last number goes in and the columns match. Then she went to help him with dinner. The first approach came on a Wednesday afternoon in the fall of 1989. She was weeding the kitchen garden when she heard a car on the gravel drive, a sound that was distinct from Walt's truck, which she knew by its particular engine note, and distinct from the farm vehicles of the neighbors she recognized. She straightened up from the garden bed, brushing dirt from her hands on her work pants, and turned toward the sound. A dark blue sedan was pulling up the drive. It was the kind of sedan that said business vehicle before you could read any other detail about it, clean and corporate, and driven by someone who kept their car as a professional presentation. The man who got out of it was young, early 30s at most, in a blazer that was slightly too pressed for a rural county call. He was carrying a leather folder with a notepad visible inside it, and he had the purposeful stride of someone who has been trained in professional confidence and deploys it on every approach. He introduced himself as a representative of Meridian Land Group and said he had a very fair offer for the corridor parcel Clara had acquired several years ago at the county auction. He said the number while making eye contact in the way that sales training teaches $10,500. Clara looked at him steadily. She looked at the folder. She looked at his shoes, which were clean in the way that shoes are clean when the person wearing them is not accustomed to gravel drives. She looked at the sedan. She looked back at his face. She said, "No, thank you." He adjusted his expression in the practiced way of someone who has been told that the first no is not a no, but an opening position. He said he wasn't sure she fully understood what was being offered. He said, $10,500 for 14 feet of unused corridor land represented considerably more than the parcel's assessed value and was more than fair by any reasonable market analysis. She said she understood the offer clearly. He said the company was certainly open to discussion if she had a different number in mind. She said she appreciated him making the trip. She said she hoped the drive back to Indianapolis was pleasant. She turned and walked back to the garden. He stood at the corner of the house for a moment. She did not look back at him. She heard in sequence his footsteps on the gravel, the car door, the engine, the sound of the car reversing down the drive, and then accelerating onto the county road. Then there was nothing except the wind in the hedge at the garden's eastern edge and the distant sound of a farm implement working in a field a mile away. She pulled 3 more weeds. Then she went inside to start lunch. Walt was in the barn when she finished lunch and went to find him. She told him a man from a company in Indianapolis had come about the strip. He asked what they wanted. She said they'd offered $10,500 for it. He raised his eyebrows, not with desire for the money, not with the urge to reconsider, but with the mild arithmetic interest of a man who finds the relationship between numbers and things interesting independent of his personal stake in them. "And you said no," he said. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He turned back to what he was doing, which was replacing a bearing on the disc harrow. She watched him work for a moment, his hands moving with the confidence of a man who has repaired the same equipment many times and knows exactly what is wrong and how to fix it. She paid the 1989 taxes in November, $13.20. Exact change. Receipt filed. She kept her twice-yearly passes on the county road. She kept her entries in the notebook. She watched the parcels around the strip change hands and accumulate improvements. A utility substation 2 miles north in 1991 survey activity on the parcel east of the strip. In 1992, a gravel access road built to the south parcel in 1993 by what she could determine from the county building permits was a contractor based in Indianapolis. In February of 1991, Walt was diagnosed with lung cancer. He had never smoked. He had spent his life outdoors in the Indiana sun and the cold and the particular combination of chemical smells that accompanied modern farming, herbicides, fertilizers, the exhaust of diesel engines. But the oncologist said that none of these were demonstrably causal, that lung cancer in non-smokers happened for reasons that were not always identifiable, that sometimes it just happens. Clara hated that phrase. She had sat in the oncologist's office on a February afternoon in Kenton, and she had heard the doctor say, "Sometimes it just happens." And she had thought, that is the least useful thing I have ever heard anyone say in a room where someone needed something useful. The cancer was advanced. The oncologist used words like aggressive trajectory and limited treatment options and quality of remaining time in the careful, practiced way of a doctor who has delivered this news many times and has learned to be honest without being brutal. Walt listened to all of it with his hands flat on his knees and his face showing nothing except the same mild, patient attention he brought to everything, and he asked 3 questions, all practical, all about what the process would look like, rather than about the probability of a different outcome. And then he thanked the doctor and stood up. In the truck driving home, he was quiet for 20 minutes. Then he said, "I'll get the winter wheat in before it gets bad." "Yes," she said. "And the equipment should be serviced before spring. I'll make a list." "Yes," she said. "You'll be all right," he said. "Yes," she said. "I will." He died on the 14th of March, 1991. He was 64 years old, and he died in the county hospital in Kenton, with Clara sitting in the chair beside his bed. The night before, in the dim late hours, when the corridor outside the room was quiet, and the only light in the room was the low glow of the monitoring equipment, he had held her hand and spoken with the deliberate care of a man conserving energy for what mattered. He had told her that he was glad they had farmed the land they farmed. He had told her that Daniel was a good boy who was going to be fine. He had told her quietly and without drama that he knew she had always understood what she was doing and that he trusted that completely and always had. Then he had said in the voice of a man who is saying something he has been carrying for a while and has decided this is the right moment, "Don't sell the strip." She had not mentioned the strip. She had not mentioned it in weeks. The strip lived in the manila folder and the tote bag and the notebook and in the part of her mind that was always tracking it, but she had not brought it into the hospital room because the hospital room was for other things. But Walt knew. He had always known more than he said, which she had always understood about him. "I won't," she said. "Good," he said. He closed his eyes. He was quiet for a long time. She held his hand and watched his face and listened to the sound of the monitoring equipment and the distant sounds of the hospital at night. Outside the window, it was the middle of March in Indiana, cold and dark and still. She drove home in the morning, and she sat at the kitchen table without taking her coat off for a long time. The house had the specific quality of quiet that houses have when someone who has lived in them for a long time is no longer there. Not empty exactly, but altered, as though the acoustic character of the space itself has changed. She sat in that quality of quiet, and she looked at the kitchen table and the coffee pot and the hook by the door where Walt's work coat hung. After a long time, she took off her coat and hung it on its hook. She got the notebook from the tote bag. She opened it to the current year's page, and she wrote the date in her careful handwriting. Below it, she wrote 2 sentences. "Walt died this morning." He said, "Don't sell the strip." Below that, on the next line, tax payment due, November, $13.20. She paid the November tax. She paid it every November after that. She paid it alone, which was different, but she paid it the same way, exact Change County Recorder's Office. Dottie at the counter receipt filed in the manila folder. She was not paying it for Walt, though she would have paid it for Walt if she had needed a reason. She was paying it because the strip was still there and the corridor designation was still active and the structural fact of what she held had not changed because Walt was gone. The world did not reorganize itself around grief. The corridor ran where it ran, and the designation said what it said, and her name was on the deed, and the taxes were due in November. These were the facts of the situation, and they did not require emotional amplification to remain facts. She drove past the strip in the spring and fall. She kept the notebook. She watched the surrounding parcels. She waited. Daniel Merritt was 16 years old in the spring of 1994, which was the first time he seriously asked himself what his mother was actually doing with the strip. He had been aware of the strip in the way you are aware of household routines that don't directly concern you as background, as pattern, as one of the things that happened in the predictable cycle of his mother's year. Every November, she went to the county recorder's office and paid $13.20 in taxes on a piece of land that nobody ever talked about. Every spring and fall, she drove the county road past a strip of grass and wrote something brief in a notebook. These things were not hidden from him. They were simply not explained to him, and at 8, 10, 12, 14 years old, he had not thought to ask. At 16, he overheard a conversation that made him ask himself the question for the first time. His Aunt Vera had come from Columbus for Easter. After the Easter dinner, while Daniel was at the kitchen table with a history assignment, Clara and Vera were in the living room talking. He heard his aunt's voice, which carried the way voices carry when someone is making an argument they believe in. "Clara, honey, 11 years. You've been paying taxes on that piece of nothing for 11 years. Walt's gone now, and the boy's going to college, and Lord knows you could use the money. That company has offered you how much? Why won't you just sell it?" He stopped writing. He looked at the wall between the rooms. His mother's voice came back even and perfectly steady, without inflection, and without any trace of reconsideration. "No." "But, Vera." A pause. "The answer is no," his mother said. "The answer has always been no, and it's going to continue to be no. I have good reasons for that. You don't need to understand them. I need you to accept that they exist. He heard Vera make the particular sound that means, I disagree, but I know when to stop. He heard the conversation move on to something else. He picked his pencil back up and looked at the history assignment. He did not go back to it immediately. He sat with what he had just heard, specifically the part where his mother had said, I have good reasons. Not, I don't want to. Not, it's none of your business, but I have good reasons, which was a different and more interesting thing to say. He filed the question away. He was 16 and there were other things to think about, but the question went into the part of his mind where things go when they are not answered, and it stayed there. In September of 1997, the county sent the letter. Daniel was home from Indiana State for the long weekend. He was 19 and in his first year studying something he described as undecided, which meant he was taking the survey courses that the university required and had not yet committed to anything more specific than that. He was at the kitchen table eating cereal when Clara came in from the mailbox with the mail. He watched her sort through the stack. He watched her stop when she reached the Brown County envelope. He watched her face as she read the letter, which gave him nothing which was normal. He watched her fold the letter and put it back in the envelope. He picked the letter up before she had turned from the table. He read the first paragraph, which explained what an abandoned parcel review was. He read the second paragraph, which listed the criteria for determining constructive abandonment. He read the third paragraph, which said that County Strip 77-204 had been identified as potentially meeting those criteria. He read the fourth paragraph, which described what would happen if the determination was made. The parcel would be subject to county reversion proceedings under Indiana Code Section 32-21-12. He looked up. "Mom," he said. "It's fine," she said. She was at the counter. "They're saying they might take it." "They might try," she said. "They won't succeed." "How do you know?" She went to the pantry. She came back with the canvas tote bag. She put it on the table. She took out the notebook. He read the notebook for a long time. He did not rush it. He turned every page carefully, and he read every entry from the first line. April 7th, 1983. Lot 77-200 for $140. Deed signed through the 14 years of subsequent entries. He read the notes on Meridian Land Group and the Indianapolis truck and the utility substation. He read the page where she had written, "They don't know," in larger letters. He read the pages that tracked the annual tax payments, each one documented with receipt number and date. He found the section where she had traced Meridian Land Group back to First Midland National Bank through the quarterly newsletter reference. He read that section twice. When he finished, he set the notebook down. He looked at his mother, who was standing at the counter with her coffee, watching him in the patient way she watched everything. "The corridor designation," he said. "It's still active." "Yes," she said. "So it can't be abandoned in the legal sense they're describing," he said, "because a utility corridor designation is a planning classification, not a land use classification. It describes what the land is designated for, not what's currently on it. The designation is the activity." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "And the county has been collecting taxes on it," he said. "Every year, 1320, which means the county itself has been treating it as an active holding. You can't collect taxes on something you're simultaneously treating as abandoned. That's contradictory." "Yes," she said. "So the letter is either wrong," he said, "or someone prompted the review hoping you wouldn't know how to respond to it." She looked at him for a moment. "I think it's the second thing," she said. "But the response is the same either way." "What do you need?" he said. "Indiana Code Section 32-21-12, she said. "The full section with the exception provisions. Today, if the library's open." He was already standing. He picked up his jacket. He found the library open and he copied the full statute from the Indiana Code volume, including the subsections and the exceptions, and he brought the copy home and gave it to her. She wrote the response that afternoon. She wrote it in her handwriting on plain paper, 4 pages single-spaced. She cited the 14 years of tax receipts. She cited the 1968 federal infrastructure filing. She cited the 1969 cancellation resolution and the footnote in its appendix. She cited Indiana Code Section 32-21-12D3, the exception for parcels with active federal infrastructure designations. She wrote at the end, "The county has actively taxed this parcel for 14 consecutive years, establishing by its own administrative practice that the parcel is an active holding under law. A parcel that is actively taxed by the county is not abandoned by its owner." Daniel read the response before she sent it. He read it straight through, then turned back and read 2 specific sections again. "This is exactly right," he said. "I know," she said. She sent it by certified mail with return receipt requested. 3 weeks later, the county sent a follow-up letter. The abandoned parcel review of County Strip 77-204 had been closed. No further action would be taken. Clara filed the letter in the manila folder. She paid the 1997 taxes in November. She told Daniel at dinner that evening they backed down. He asked why she had known they would. "Because the documents were right," she said, "and they knew it when they looked at them." He stood at the sink after dinner doing the dishes, and he thought about 14 years of $13 tax payments and a canal folder full of documents, and a woman who had known since 1983 exactly what she had and had been waiting without complaint or visible strain for the world to arrive at the point where that knowledge could be used. He thought about his father at the hospital saying, "Don't sell the strip," and the fact that his father had said it without having it explained to him because some things between people who know each other completely don't require explanation. He changed his major the following semester to pre-law. In November of 2001, Clara went to the county recorder's office for her annual tax payment and learned that 3 parcels previously held by Meridian Land Group had transferred to a new entity called Keystone Infrastructure Holdings, LLC, registered in Delaware. She spent 2 hours at the library's public computer terminal that afternoon. The search was more complicated than she expected because the corporate structure involved multiple layers, but she was patient with the search, the way she was patient with everything, and when she was done, she had traced the full lineage. Keystone Infrastructure Holdings was a Delaware LLC formed in 1999 as a subsidiary of Centrex Development Group, a Chicago infrastructure investment fund. Centrex had completed a regional banking acquisition in 1998 that had included First Midland National Bank. In absorbing First Midland, Centrex had absorbed all of First Midland's subsidiaries, including Meridian Land Group, whose operations and assets had been folded into the new Keystone Infrastructure Holdings entity. The parcel assembly that had begun under Meridian Land Group in 1984 had continued through the corporate restructuring under Keystone Infrastructure Holdings. The same parcels, the same corridor, the same strategy now operating under a new name, connected to a larger organization with significantly more capital. The strip was still at the center of what they were assembling. They had still not approached her. 18 years of assembly, and the gap at the center of the corridor remained exactly as she had bought it in 1983. She drove home and opened the notebook to a fresh page. She wrote the acquisition chain, First Midland National / Meridian Land Group, to absorbed by Centrex Development Group 1998 to rebranded as Keystone Infrastructure Holdings 1999, continuing parcel assembly in Midlands County Eastern Corridor. She wrote, "They still don't know what they're assembling around." And then, find out what Keystone is planning. It took 4 months of evening research at the library terminal and 4 public records requests, 2 to the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission, 1 to the Federal Pipeline, and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, and one to the Army Corps of Engineers to assemble the picture. Keystone Infrastructure Holdings was the lead developer on a proposed natural gas transmission pipeline called the Midland Basin Connector. The pipeline would run from a processing facility in central Indiana to a distribution hub near the Ohio border, a distance of approximately 140 miles. The proposed corridor for the pipeline had been submitted to the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission for preliminary review. The route ran north to south through the eastern section of Midlands County. Through the corridor, the engineering reports, which were part of the public regulatory record, described the eastern route as the preferred alignment for the following reasons: lower construction cost than the western alternative, avoidance of the drainage districts and wetland buffers that complicated the western route, and the phrase that she read 4 times alignment with existing utility right-of-way planning designations from the county's earlier road development programs, which provided a pre-established legal framework for the pipeline corridor. Pre-established legal framework. The 1968 designation. The corridor that had never been dissolved. The corridor that ran through County Strip 77-204. They were planning to build their pipeline through her corridor, and they had described it in their own regulatory filing as a pre-established legal framework. They had described it as an advantage. They had not yet discovered that the advantage came with a condition: the corridor's owner. She showed Daniel the regulatory filings at Thanksgiving. He was 24 and in his second year of law school at Indiana University. He read with the focused attention of someone who has developed the skill of reading documents, not just for what they say, but for what they imply and what they require and what they expose. He looked up. "They have to go through the strip." "Yes," she said. "Is the western alternative viable?" 50% more expensive, she said. Crosses 3 drainage districts and 2 protected wetland buffers. The environmental review alone adds 2 years to the federal approval timeline. So they're committed to the eastern route. The eastern route is the project, she said. Without it, there's no economically viable project. And your corridor is in the middle of the eastern route. Dead center, she said. 6/10 of a mile through the heart of their alignment. He was quiet for a moment. They haven't come to you. Not since 1989, she said. Which means they either don't know the strip has a separate owner, or they know and they're waiting until the project is too invested to be stopped before they approach you. I've thought about both possibilities, she said. If they knew and were strategically waiting, they would have secured some form of preliminary agreement before spending capital on federal regulatory review. Any project attorney would require that. They didn't secure a preliminary agreement, so either they don't know or they have a legal theory that doesn't require my agreement. The first is possible. The second is wrong. He considered this. I think they don't know, he said. I think someone in 1984 identified the corridor on a planning map, saw that it was designated federal utility right-of-way, saw that the road project had been canceled, assumed the designation lapsed with the project, and never checked. That's what I think, she said, which means they're going to hit a wall. Yes, she said, and when they do, they'll come to me. And when they come to you, he said, what do you want? She told him. Not everything she had not yet told anyone, everything but the outline of what she had been thinking since the night Philip Stearns would come to her door, which was still a year and a half in the future, though neither of them knew the timing yet. She told him about the monthly payment structure, about the inflation adjustment, about the hereditary transfer. She told him why a lump sum was the wrong answer. She told him how the structure worked and what it was designed to accomplish. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. I want to be part of this when the time comes, he said. She nodded. Good, she said. That's why I'm telling you. In the fall of 2003, Philip Stearns came to her door. He was 52, silver-haired, a suit that had been tailored by someone who knew what they were doing, shoes that had been polished that morning. He was senior counsel for Keystone Infrastructure Holdings, and he had the measured confidence of a man who has been in difficult negotiations many times and knows that preparation is the difference between winning and losing. He accepted her offer of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table and was, by any professional standard, pleasant and direct. He said Keystone needed an easement across County Strip 77-204 and was prepared to offer $225,000 for a permanent easement agreement, one payment full release of all claims. She said no. He said this was a significant sum. She said she was aware of that. He said Keystone could potentially improve the number. She said she would prefer future communications in writing. She showed him to the door. Daniel had been in the living room for the entire conversation. He came into the kitchen after the door closed and sat across from his mother and looked at her. $225,000, he said. Yes, she said. And you said no. Yes, she said. Because the right answer isn't a number, he said. She looked at him. He had arrived at the same place she had arrived at in 1983. Yes, she said. She told him the terms in full for the first time, all of them with the reasoning behind each element. He asked 2 clarifying questions. She answered both. He said he wanted to help. She said she knew. She said that was why she had been preparing him for this since 1997. In the fall of 2005, Keystone's attorneys filed a motion with the Midlands County Commissioner's Office requesting that County Strip 77-204 be reclassified as surplus land subject to eminent domain acquisition. The motion was sophisticated. It was wrong. Clara and Daniel spent 3 days assembling the response, which was 9 pages, and cited 11 statutes and 4 federal regulatory filings and every year's tax receipt back to 1983. Its central argument was that a federally designated utility corridor could not be reclassified under state surplus land law without first dissolving the federal designation through the appropriate dual administrative channels, which had not been done and which Keystone had not even attempted to initiate. The county's own attorney read the response and advised the commissioners in closed session, the minutes of which were public record, that proceeding with the reclassification would result in a lawsuit the county would lose. The commissioners voted 3-1 to deny the motion. Clara paid her November taxes, $13.20, same as always. She went home and called Daniel and told him they had denied it. He said he knew. She said good work. He said he had been getting ready for it for 6 years. In January of 2023, the Department of Energy announced approval of the Midland Basin Energy Corridor, a $3.4 billion natural gas transmission network. Lead developer, Apex Regional Partners, LLC, Eastern Corridor route, through Midlands County, through the Strip. Clara called Daniel the morning of the announcement. You saw it, he said. Eastern Corridor, she said, through the Strip. Apex Regional Partners, he said. How many names now? 4, she said. Meridian, Keystone, Centrex, Apex. You have the whole chain. It's in the notebook, she said. She told him the terms, the full terms, as she had refined them over the previous 20 years. Monthly payment rather than lump sum, inflation adjustment keyed to the Consumer Price Index, hereditary transfer to Daniel and his heirs, binding on all successor parcel owners, effective for the operational life of the corridor projected by Apex's own engineering reports at minimum 45 years. He said these were good terms. She said she knew. He said the inflation clause would face objection. She said yes. He said the hereditary transfer would face harder objection. She said yes. He said he would make sure the objections didn't work. Then she told him about the memo. She had found it in 2006 in the FDIC's public archive of First Midland National Bank's annual reports and underlying documentation. In 1986, Garrison Holst, then Regional VP of Commercial Real Estate at First Midland National, had written a 3-page memorandum to the bank's acquisition committee assessing the corridor parcel assembly strategy in Midlands County. Most of the memo was financial analysis. But in the 3rd page, under the heading Potential Encumbrances, Holst had written, "It should be noted that county recorder records indicate a separately owned parcel within the proposed corridor footprint, County Strip 77-204, which carries an active federal utility corridor designation originating from CR Project 14-C1968 INDATI. This designation has not been dissolved through the appropriate administrative channels and may constitute a legal encumbrance on full corridor assembly. Recommend the Acquisition Committee engage external legal counsel to assess available options for resolving this encumbrance before committing additional capital to parcel assembly." The committee had noted the recommendation. It had deferred action. No legal counsel had been engaged. The assembly had continued. The encumbrance had never been resolved, and every subsequent entity, Keystone Centrex Apex, had acquired the surrounding parcels with full access to First Midland National's corporate records, which meant they had acquired them with constructive notice of the 1986 memo and with constructive knowledge of the encumbrance the memo described. Daniel was silent on the phone for a long moment. "The memo is in the FDIC archive," he said. "I've had a copy since 2006, she said. "Second folder." "Mom." His voice was careful and precise. "Do you understand what this means if they file any kind of proceeding to try to acquire the strip without your consent?" "Yes," she said. "It means they cannot claim they didn't know. The encumbrance was documented in their predecessor's corporate record. Every acquiring entity had access to that record, which means every entity in the chain Keystone Centrex Apex proceeded with development despite having constructive notice of a documented legal encumbrance. That's not an oversight, that's a choice." "Yes," she said, "I've known that for 17 years. "That changes the negotiation entirely," he said. "They don't have a legal fallback position. Every theory they might use to acquire the strip without your consent fails in the face of that memo." "Yes," she said. "Now find out if Garrison Holst is still connected to Apex." In November of 2023, Apex filed the abandonment claim. Clara read all 22 pages at the kitchen table. She made 2 notes in the margins of her printed copy. She put it in the second folder and called Daniel. He said they're scared. The Federal Development Agreement has deadline clauses. If they can't demonstrate corridor access by the second quarter of 2024, they face penalty exposure in the range of $40 to $60 million. They're trying to eliminate her leverage before the negotiation begins. She said, "Will it work?" He said no. The memo plus 40 years of tax receipts plus the undissolved federal designation. The abandonment theory fails on all 3 grounds simultaneously. The hearing was February 12th. Midlands County Common Pleas. She wore the gray wool coat. She brought both folders. 4 people on the Apex side of the aisle, 2 attorneys, a project manager, and at the end of the row in a dark suit, not looking at the plaintiff's table, Garrison Holst, 79 years old, still broad-shouldered, though the breadth had settled with age into something heavier and less certain. He was listed as a fact witness. His presence meant Apex had found the memo in their own corporate records and had decided to put Holst on the stand to provide a controlled characterization of its significance before the other side could use it. It was a reasonable tactical instinct. It was 17 years too late. Daniel placed 3 documents on the plaintiff's table: the 1968 federal infrastructure filing, the 1969 cancellation resolution, with the footnote highlighted, 40 years of tax receipts bound with a binder clip. He said 5 sentences. A utility corridor designation is not a development improvement. It is a legal classification that exists independently of physical use. A parcel bearing an active federal utility corridor designation cannot be constructively abandoned under Indiana law without first dissolving that designation through the appropriate administrative channels, which has not occurred. The county has taxed this parcel as an active holding for 40 consecutive years. You cannot simultaneously tax a property as active and claim it has been abandoned. He sat down. Judge Frances Dodd looked at the tax receipts. She looked at the 1968 filing. She looked at the 1969 resolution. She looked at her notepad. She said, "Motion denied." Active holding under federal and state classification continuously maintained no legal basis for abandonment. 85 seconds. In the hallway, Garrison Holst stopped in front of Clara. He was old. He was diminished in the way of men who have aged harder than they expected. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has finally, at 79 years old, understood something he should have understood at 41. He said, "I recommended they deal with you in 1986. I put it in the memo." "I know," Clara said. He said, "You knew about the memo." "Since 2006, she said. He looked at the folders under her arm. He looked at Daniel standing beside her. He said, "Mrs. Merritt, I'm sorry they didn't listen." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the auction in 1983, the laugh, the strip of nothing, 40 years of $13 payments. Walt's voice in a hospital room in the middle of the night. "I know you are," she said. The negotiation lasted 4 weeks. Apex offered $3.2 million lump sum. Daniel said no. They offered $3.8 million. Daniel said no. They pushed on the timeline. Every week of delay cost them penalty exposure in the range of $400,000. Daniel presented Clara's terms. Monthly payment of $5,800. Annual CPI adjustment with a ceiling of twice the prior year's change. Hereditary transfer to Daniel and his heirs in perpetuity, binding on all successor parcel owners. Effective for the operational life of the corridor. 3 days on the inflation clause. Daniel said not negotiable. 2 days on the hereditary transfer. Daniel said not negotiable either. On day 27, Apex accepted every term. Daniel called her that evening. "They took it," he said. She was at the kitchen table. "All of it. Every term," he said. "First payment in April." "Same month as the taxes," she said. He laughed. It was Walt's laugh. Slow and certain, and finding the world genuinely interesting. She had not heard that laugh in a long time, and it moved through her in a way she did not try to describe. The signing was on a Thursday morning in March. Clara wore the gray wool coat. She brought both folders. She counted the contents the night before: 83 documents from the 1983 deed to the February hearing dismissal. She added the signed easement agreement after the signing. 84. She sat in the truck in the parking lot of the county clerk's office, and she opened the notebook to the first blank page after the last entry. She wrote 4 things. The date. The monthly payment, $5,800. The year and the price, 1983, $140. And below that, $13.20 a year for 40 years. $5,800 a month for the rest of my life and Daniel's life after mine for as long as the corridor stands. She closed the notebook. She drove home. Daniel came for dinner. She made pot roast Walt's recipe. They ate at the kitchen table and talked about practical things, the payment schedule, the binding clause, what the transfer process would look like. After dinner, she opened the notebook to the last written page and slid it across the table to him. He read it. He read it a second time. When he looked up, his eyes were wet, and he made no effort to conceal this because he was his father's son, and his mother had always believed there was no virtue in concealing the weight of something real. "You left me something," he said. She shook her head. "I left us both something. Your father started it. He said don't sell the strip at the end of his life, and he was right about that the way he was right about most things. I kept it. Now you carry it." He took the notebook from the table. He held it with both hands. She looked at him, holding it, her son, 45 years old, with his father's eyes and something in the steadiness of his face that was entirely his own, something that had been formed by watching her do what she did for the past 26 years since he had read the notebook the first time. "The taxes are paid through the year," she said. "I know," he said. "The corridor designation is on file. The easement is registered. The hereditary clause is binding." "I know, Mom." "So there's nothing left to do," she said, "except wait for April." Outside in the cold March evening, the Apex survey crews had been working since the previous week, marking the corridor alignment with stakes and flags, the same white pickup trucks with Indianapolis plates she had watched from a farm access road 40 years ago. The alignment ran through County Strip 77-204 exactly as she had known it would. The trucks moved slowly across the field with their headlights cutting through the dark in long arcs, working in what had always been her corridor, what had always been her right, what had been waiting for exactly this since 1968, when someone in a government office in Indianapolis had signed a form assigning a federal utility corridor designation to a survey right-of-way in the eastern section of Midlands County, Indiana, and nobody had ever undone it. She turned off the kitchen light when Daniel left. She stood in the dark for a moment and listened to his car receding down the county road. She went to bed. The first check came in April. Plain envelope. $5,800. Memo line, easement payment, County Strip, 77-200, 4 April 2024. She looked at it for a moment at the kitchen table. Then she filed it in the second folder behind the 84 documents that preceded it in the order that things had happened. She made coffee. She picked up the notebook. She opened it to the last written page. Below the 4 things she had written in the truck on the morning of the signing, she added one line. Worth waiting for. She closed the notebook. She put the kettle on. Some people look at 14 feet of unmowed grass running along a fence row in a county nobody pays attention to and see nothing. They see a remnant. They see a leftover. They see a strip of nothing. They say so in front of the room, and the room smiles, and the gavel comes down at $140, and everyone moves on. Clara Merritt looked at 14 feet of unmowed grass and saw a question. She saw what connects to what, and what has to travel through whatever connects them, and who gets to decide the terms of that travel when the time comes. She spent 6 weeks finding the answer. She spent 40 years waiting for the answer to matter to everyone else. She was right. She kept the records. She paid $13.20 every November for 40 years. She said no every time they offered a number, and she knew from the beginning that the right answer was never a number. It was a structure, a permanent arrangement, a continuing claim that would outlast her and flow forward to her son and to his children for as long as the corridor stood and the designation held, and the check came every April in a plain envelope addressed to whoever her family had become by then. $140 in 1983. $5,800 a month in 2024, every month after that for as long as the corridor stands. She was the only person in that auction room who understood what she was buying. She made sure she was. That was all it took.